Today's presentation is on the Rwandan genocide. It's also known as the Tutsi genocide, which is in and of itself an interesting debate. Should genocides take the name of the place where they occurred? Should it take the name of the victim population? Should it take the name of the perpetrator population? For example, we talk about the Armenian genocide, and the Armenians are the victim population. When we talk about the German genocides, it's the ethnic Germans who are perpetrating the genocide and so forth. And the reason that I even raised this is because in the West, we always call this genocide the Rwandan genocide. I have had the blessing of becoming really good friends with the director of the Kigali Memorial in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. And he has pushed me on this, that in Rwanda, they prefer that it's called the Tutsi genocide. His point and perspective is that it's the Tutsis that were the victim population, and we need to remember that it was the Tutsis that were the victim population. As I'll talk about in a little bit, I do struggle with that a little bit because there is a third ethnic group in Rwanda, the Twa people, and the Twa people were decimated as well. So my pushback on calling it the Tutsi genocide, which is great because it's identifying the Tutsis and giving them recognition for their suffering, but at the same time, it also ignores the Twa people as well. So again, we're framing all these presentations within the context of the major genocides of the 20th and 21st centuries. If you want to see daily updates about my work and the work of Antoine, who's the director of the Kigali Museum in Rwanda, you can go to our blog, which is This Day in Genocide. It's on Facebook, and love to have you follow along. So Rwanda is an interesting country. It's a very small country in Africa, which is in and of itself unusual. Eritrea, I believe, is the smallest country in Africa. A lot of the countries in Africa, and there are almost 50 countries in Africa, a lot of them are, in terms of land territory, very large. So Rwanda is located in the region of Africa known as the Lakes region. It's usually categorized or spoken about within the framework or the context of Burundi, because they have a similar ethnic composition, as well as Uganda and that what we now call the Democratic Republic of Congo. But for example, Rwanda also neighbors Tanzania, but you'd be hard pressed to find academic work or literature that combines Tanzania and Rwanda. So this Lakes region is named after the fact that this is where the major large freshwater lakes, for example, the largest lake in Africa, Lake Victoria, is located. And that's one of the reasons that these are smaller countries, because they have higher population densities, because they are more lush and more inhabitable. And as well as it's an effect of the colonization by Europeans. So this region was originally colonized by Germany. And when the Germans came into the area, they adopted a policy very similar to what the British did, where they divided the internal population and pitted them against each other. And the Germans believed that the Tutsis looked more European and therefore were better, more civilized, and so forth. And they thought that the Hutus looked more African, whatever that means. And they pitted the Hutus and the Tutsis against each other. Prior to European contact, the Tutsis and the Hutus lived peacefully together. In fact, it's almost a misnomer to even call them separate groups. They are ethnically intertwined, genetically intertwined. And the Twa people, the smallest ethnic group in Rwanda, are in the more remote parts of Rwanda. It's the smallest population, and they're also the least urban. They are in the outlying bush, as they call it, in Africa. And so the Germans pitted the Hutus and the Tutsis against each other and established their colonial protectorate. After World War I, that protectorate was transferred away from Germany. And so it became part of the French sphere of influence. Most Rwandans speak French and English as well as their indigenous languages. And that's really one of the important points here, that a lot of African history in the last 150 years has been a linguistical battle or a cultural influence battle between Britain and the United States, because the United States speaks English as well, and France. And we'll talk about that more later. But basically, although a lot of Rwandans speak 3 languages at least, the Tutsis speak more English and the Hutus speak more French. More on that in a bit. When we look at the stages of genocide by Dr. Gregory Stanton from the US State Department, now with Genocide Watch, again, we talk about this us and them idea that plays out, and you can hear in my introduction, we already have an us and them, Hutu and Tutsi and Twa, and it's exasperated by European colonists. And so these Germans, and then later the Belgians, again, Belgians, most of them speaking French, particularly the Flems, the Walloon people of Belgium speak German, but the Belgians are in what I would call the French sphere of influence. And so when the Germans lose World War I and the protectorate is transferred to Belgium, this is how French is introduced to the region. But the Belgians continue this genetic, biblical, racial interpretation of the ethnic tribes. And they believe that these Tutsis are descendants from the lost tribe of Ham of Israel. And that must be why they're taller or have higher cheekbones and less African looking, whatever that means again, noses and so forth. And so they're introducing a racial stereotype and division that doesn't exist originally in the Rwandan area. And then in terms of symbolization, the adding of specific labels, if you will, for example, the yellow Star of David in terms of the German genocide, the Holocaust, in this stage of symbolization, where we can see it playing out in Rwanda as we build up to 1994 and the major genocide. There were mass slaughters prior, but the major genocide occurs in 1994. Well, they were putting the tribal designations on people's identity cards. These identity cards, by law, you have to carry on you, equivalent of what we would call our driver's licenses, but this is for both driving and ethnic identity as well. Putting these tribal designations on the identity cards then made it really easy then to commit genocide, because you could demand identity cards. And if somebody pulled out their identity card and they had the wrong tribal designation, you could kill them. And if they said that they didn't have their identity card, well, then you could presume that they're lying and hiding the fact, and therefore they must be other, and then you kill them. So these identity cards are part of the symbolization, as well as really the classification and others as well. But they also, similar to US cultural laws and traditions, you have this interpretation of identity being almost like a one-drop policy, because there is intermarriage in Rwanda, just like in all human cultures around the world. But the idea that children who are mixed are classified not as mixed, but as being one or the other complicates this process. And I mentioned that these identity cards are part of the symbolization stage, but you can see how it overlaps with the classification stage. It's also related to the discrimination stage, because this is when the dominant group uses laws to deny rights to other groups. Well, the Hutus, for most of Rwanda's independence post-colonization, the Hutus were the dominant ethnic group in terms of economics and politics. And they discriminated against Tutsis. And how do you know somebody's Tutsi? You know they're Tutsi because of their identity card. And so in the, I think the late 70s, early 80s, there was this mass exodus of a lot of Tutsis out of Rwanda to avoid massacres and persecution, as well as legal discrimination. And they migrated into Uganda and became actually part of the a specialized unit in the Ugandan army even. And so you have this diaspora population of Tutsis living in Uganda, which, if you think about it, messes up the ratio or the balance of ethnic division even more in favor of the Hutus, which then emboldens the Hutus to discriminate against the Tutsis who stayed and remained in Rwanda even more. So stages 1, 2, and 3 are very similar in the Rwandan genocide. This discrimination, as I said, was exasperated by the diaspora of Tutsis into Uganda, which is involved in the massacres in Uganda as well. The famous Idi Amin, who was finally overthrown in 1979 with the support of the Tutsi diaspora army known as the FPR. And this is really important because the FPR gets military training in Uganda from the Ugandan government, as well as from the British government. So again, you have this tension where the Hutus are receiving financial and political support in Rwanda from France, but the Tutsis in Uganda are getting military training and therefore linguistical training and or reinforcement of a linguistical connection to the English-speaking world by being part of the Ugandan army. And we'll talk about the genocide in more detail in a few moments, but to give you a glimpse, a spoiler alert, it is this FPR army that is made up of Rwandan Tutsis, but living in Uganda. When the genocide starts, it is the FPR that returns to Rwanda in 1994 and ends the genocide. I mean, I don't even know what to say about stage 4. There's dehumanization in all of these genocides, and they're all disgusting. You know, the official definition by Dr. Stanton about dehumanization is when human beings are equated with animals, vermin, diseases, and insects. And I don't know if there's a better example of using these animals and vermin in terms of degrading human beings. I don't know of a better example than the U.S. treatment of Native Americans in terms of mascots and Rwanda. This speech that was given in 1992 is really considered to be the major foreshadowing, maybe catalyst even, for the 1994 genocide. And you have this man, Leon Mugesera, who gives this famous speech at a Hutu political party where he describes Tutsis as cockroaches. Nobody likes cockroaches. They don't serve a purpose. You kill them. You want to, use pesticide and eliminate them, right? Well, Leon also referred to Tutsis as snakes and said, what do you do with snakes? You cut their heads off and you throw their bodies in the river. And here is really important that he said that the Tutsis should be dropped into the river and then go back where they came from. So this idea that they don't belong, which again, where does this idea that Tutsis do not belong come from? It started with the Germans and continued with the Belgians with this ridiculous idea that the Tutsis were somehow the lost Israelite tribe of Ham and therefore more European and therefore more civilized and so forth. You have this being internalized and then used by the Hutsis against the Tutsis, that they don't belong in Rwanda, and therefore it's okay to kill them and to eliminate them, remove them, and so forth. In every genocide, we see there's an organization phase where the perpetrator population usually is in charge of the government, but they usually empower a paramilitary or a sub-governmental organization to prepare for the genocide for multiple reasons, but a lot of it, I think, has to do with plausible deniability, that the government can then say that they weren't part of it. And so again, you have the special units in the Armenian genocide. You have the SA, the brown shirts in the German genocide. You have the Janjaweed in the Darfur genocide and so forth. Well, in the Rwandan genocide, they have this militia of Hutus, and you can see here on the right a picture of them practicing and training. They're getting training from members of the Rwandan army and the national police. They're getting weapons, and we'll talk about the weapons that they receive in a moment, but in this image you can see that they're carrying wooden guns. And while wooden guns might not shoot, think about if you were a Tutsi civilian watching this group of Hutu militiamen chanting, marching, carrying wooden guns, carrying machetes. This is a form of intimidation as well. And this is exasperated by polarization. The fact that the government supported radio stations that had programming that reinforced everything that we've already said, that Tutsis don't belong. Polarization, though, this is a way that the populations in both the Hutu and Tutsi populations are driven apart, wedged apart. And again, in polarization, it's exasperated by these identity cards that people know what ethnic group people are within. And here, going back to Leon Mugesera, here's another quote. Don't be afraid. You do not cut is the one that will come back and cut your neck. This idea of us versus them, which again goes back to stage one and classification, but this us and them mentality being reinforced by the media, by the government, and the militias. I'm happy to be able to tell you that eventually these radio personalities were put on trial and charged with genocide and war crimes. That, in the United States, we talk often about freedom of speech. Freedom of speech ends when you take away other people's rights. And so the fact that these radio personalities and this newspaper editor were convicted of genocide, I think is very powerful. And we need to look at, even in the United States, we could look at our own media and how inflammatory they have become. The preparation stage is the final solution, right? We've heard the Armenian question, the Jewish question. Well, this becomes the Tutsi question, and the idea that they have to kill the Tutsis, as I just said, because it's us versus them, and that's what they've been told. And this is where I get really heated. There are not enough industrial plants in Rwanda to mass produce weapons, whether they be guns or even simple machetes. Okay, where do people in Rwanda get guns from? Where do they have high volume machetes developed, built, whatever, manufactured, and then purchased? They're coming from other countries. So when you think about in the United States in terms of homicide, then in a lot of states, you can charge the person who sells the gun or hands the gun to a murderer. You can charge them either as a murderer themselves or an accessory to murder. So I want to ask you, I want to ask the international community, what happened to the people who provided the weapons to the Hutu militias and the Hutu army? Where did these machetes come from? They didn't come from Rwanda, as I said. They came from a bank loan from one of the largest banks in France. It's called Crédit Lyons. We know Crédit Lyons fundraised or funded the genocide. It comes back to that linguistical division of Africa. On the map on the left, the countries that are blue are in the Anglo-Saxon English-speaking sphere of influence. And the countries that are green are in the Franco-speaking linguistical sphere of influence. That part of what France was doing was they were trying to protect their influence in Rwanda. What movies are the civilians in Rwanda going to go to the movie theater and watch? Are they going to watch movies in English or in French? What language are the textbooks going to be in school? Are the textbooks in school going to be in English or in French? So I want to make this abundantly clear. The French bankrolled the Rwandan genocide out of a fear of losing economic influence and cultural influence in the country. How many people had to die because France wants people to read books in French and go to movies in French? Look at what French machetes did. This image on the right is far from unique. We can see these throughout Rwanda. And the way Rwanda today remembers the genocide is that, much like the Cambodian genocide memorials, they keep the skulls and the clothing and the blood stains, they keep it very visible. That is a machete mark on a human skull. How hard do you have to swing a machete to puncture a human skull? How dehumanized must you feel that other human being in front of you is to be able to swing that machete that hard? Stage 8, the persecution stage. These are when the death lists are drawn up. And again, when identity cards say what tribe you're from, you don't even really have to develop death lists. It's more in this stage in Rwanda where it's about the targeting of geographic populations because they know how to divide the populations once they get there. And what sets this all in motion, everything that I've said already, a lot of it has been occurring in here and there for 20, 30 years in Rwanda. Small massacres, small diaspora flight of Tutsi populations, and it's everything simmering under the entire culture, society of Rwanda. Well, what the catalyst is, what sets off the mass genocide is a plane crash. On April 6, 1994, there was a plane, and in that plane was the president of Rwanda, as well as the president of Burundi, by the way, and that plane crashed. And to this day, we do not know the whole story of that plane being crashed. One argument that is pushed by the Tutsi population is that the extremist Hutus crashed the plane because they thought that the president was too moderate. So the Tutsis think that the Hutus crashed the plane because the Hutu president was too moderate, and the Hutus believe that the Tutsis, particularly that diaspora army that's in Uganda, used a rocket launcher to take down the plane to kind of precipitate the genocide, to give them an excuse, the RPF, to come back. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, that we call it the RPF in English, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. In French, the letters are reversed. So we don't know what happened, but what we do know is in basically 90 days, in only 3 months, 1 million human beings were murdered, and most of those were murdered by machetes. That's the entire population of the state of Rhode Island dead in 90 days. This is the genocide. Stage 9, the extermination. And these pictures are disturbing. That they begin with the death of the president of Rwanda and the death of the prime minister of Rwanda, and the Hutu militias, with the support of the national police and the support of the army, and fanned by the media and newspapers, but primarily on radio, start massacring human beings because of their identity cards. This is Africa. This is the lake region of Africa. It is humid. It is hot. Look at the decomposing moisture stains around that human being. Look at that boy who doesn't know what's happening. That boy might not even know whether he's Hutu or Tutsi. What's his story? Where are his parents? This happened in 1994. Where is he today? I showed you the skull with the machete mark. Look at these survivor marks from machetes. Look at the scalp of that person, the top of their head, and that scar from somebody swinging a machete at them. Look at that girl's beautiful, beautiful smile in that picture on the left, framed by a scar from a machete swung just because she was a different tribe. And just like the Holocaust, there are people who say, well, we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know it was bad. And that's just not true. How does the Hutu government get a loan from Credit Lyons and ship the machetes without people knowing what was going to happen, or people not being able to imagine what was going to happen? This is what happened. This is a school. We see this over and over in the Rwandan genocide, where children rushed to schools for protection and they didn't get it. Rwanda is primarily a Catholic country. The civilian population rushed to the convents, rushed to the Catholic churches for protection. And in some cases, the Hutus just charged in and massacred the Tutsis. In some cases, the abbotesses or the priests just opened the doors and let the Hutus in. There are numerous leaders of the Catholic Church in Rwanda that were charged as accessories to genocide because they allowed it to happen. When the Rwandan Patriotic Front started then coming in from the north, from Uganda, two things kind of happened simultaneously. You had Hutus who then increased their slaughtering of Tutsis because they knew that the Tutsi army was coming to get them, so they tried to kill as many more Tutsis as possible. And at the same time, some Hutus started fleeing Rwanda and moving west into Zaire, what we now call the Democratic Republic of Congo. So what began as a diaspora population of Tutsis in Uganda then becomes a diaspora population of Hutus migrating into Zaire. But remember the balance of power in the United Nations Security Council, the P5, the members that have the right to veto everything: the United States, Russia, China, England, and France. So what is the international community's response to all of this? What are they doing when human beings are being slaughtered by thousands and thousands and thousands by machetes funded by a French bank? The UN had sent in a small peacekeeping force even before the plane crash in April, with the rhetoric and the ethnic tensions escalating. There was a small Chapter 6 mandate Blue Helmet Army that was sent in there. And the international community, led by France, loves to say, well, we didn't know that there was going to be a genocide. We didn't know how bad it was going to get. Wow, it got bad so quickly we didn't have a chance to respond. And that is factually, categorically not true. That is a form of denial. What we know is that the UN did nothing. That small Blue Helmet Army, which was commanded, by the way, by a Canadian general named Romeo Dallaire, more about him in a moment or so, that the UN likes to say that they weren't in a position to give rules of engagement to allow Romeo Dallaire to prevent the genocide. They weren't in a position to stop the genocide. They had no way of knowing that machetes could be used in genocide. Look at this ridiculous quote by the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time. I believe Boutros Ghali is his name. For us, genocide was the gas chamber. What happened in Germany? We were not able to realize that with a machete you could create what? You couldn't imagine that a genocide could occur by machete? And again, think about it. He's comparing it to the Holocaust. This is 1994. There's simultaneously a genocide happening in Europe, in Bosnia, and the UN community really dropped the ball on that. And there was the genocide less than 20 years earlier than this genocide in Cambodia. But this international amnesia that genocide's not really happening all around us, and that we equate everything back to Germany. This is Romeo Dallaire. He is the white knight in this story. He called the UN and asked for rules of engagement which would allow him to stop the Hutu militias. And the United Nations told him to stand down, and they told him not to. And again, they come up with this, manufactured argument that there were not enough UN soldiers that could have stopped it. And Romeo Dallaire, in his books, talks about how ridiculous that is. He said, I'm a Canadian general. I have armed international soldiers with rifles, with APCs, armored personnel carriers. And you're telling me that with armored personnel carriers and military training and rifles, that I can't stop a militia mob with sticks and machetes? And he asked for more support, more troops, and rules of engagement. And it's the Security Council that said no. Who's on the Security Council? The P5 who have veto power. And who was the one that wouldn't let the UN go in and stop the genocide? Is France. And the United States let this happen because they were interested in their relationships with France, and because they were also distracted by the Bosnian genocide. It was not the international community who ended this genocide. So just like the international community didn't do anything in the Armenian genocide, and just like the international community didn't do anything during the German genocides up until when Germany then invaded Poland and it became an international war, then the international community gets involved for the purposes of territorial integrity and war, not genocide. And the international community didn't do anything in the Cambodian genocide. In fact, as we talked about, the US destabilized Cambodia, which actually allowed the Khmer Rouge to commit that genocide. So again, we see this pattern where the UN, the international community, the United States doesn't stand up for its own values and its espoused values of protecting human rights. It is an army of Tutsis from Uganda that come down from the north, invading their former homeland to protect the civilian populations of the Tutsis that remain. And again, the Hutu extremists believe that the Tutsis manufactured the plane crash in order to give them an excuse to invade, which, if you think about it, is such a mirage argument, because the counter argument should be, what were you doing to the Tutsi population which would make the Tutsis want to come in and protect their people? What were you doing that made them feel the need to shoot down an airplane in order to return to their homeland? Like, it's such a nonsensical argument. And it gets even worse. As the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Tutsi army trained by the Brits and the Americans, I forgot to mention that the general of the RPF, the general of the Tutsi army, is a man named Paul Kagame, who trained at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas in the United States. So while we can take some solace in the fact that our government trained this man who is responsible for ending the genocide, we can also hold our country accountable, President Clinton accountable, why more wasn't done in the Bosnian genocide or in the Rwandan genocide. But guess what? even as this is unfolding, as the Tutsi army is coming down from the north, now all of a sudden France wants to do something. And France sets up so-called safe zones and dispatches French troops to protect the Hutus from the invading Tutsi army. Why is France more invested in protecting Hutus from the invading Tutsi army than they were in protecting the Tutsi civilian population from the Hutu militia that they funded and provided the machetes to? It's so nonsensical. This is Paul Kagame, and he is one of the more fascinating leaders in Africa today. He's the president of Rwanda. So there's one school of thought that considers him to be the new generation of African leaders, that he was trained by the Brits and the Americans. While he had a military rank, he didn't impose himself politically at the end of the genocide. He became the defense minister in the new Rwandan government and did not take over the political powers of the presidency. But other people criticize him, saying that that's a sham and that he was really running the presidency from behind the scenes. And as I said, today, he is the president. And there have been people that have criticized the revision of history textbooks in Rwanda that ascribe all of the blame to the Tutsis. And there are people that say that the way history is told in Rwanda is not balanced. On the other hand, again, my friend Antoine, the director of the Kigali Genocide Memorial, is a very big fan of Paul Kagame and says that he is doing the right thing. And in Rwanda today, from my understanding, talking to Antoine, people don't talk about which tribe they belong to. I didn't know which ethnic group Antoine was from for years after we became friends. And he could be the norm. He could be unique. I really don't know enough. I'm just sharing my own personal lived experiences and anecdotes that I've heard. So Paul Kagame's army comes in and eventually takes over the government, and the Hutus that were responsible for the genocide either fled to Zaire in the West or other countries in Africa. And fortunately, it's over in 90 days. But again, 1 million people killed in 90 days. Other estimates are 800,000 in 100 days. You get the idea. It is a very fast genocide. These refugees from the Hutu populations that flee the country, some of these people are innocent, right? They're afraid of a counter genocide. They're afraid that they're going to be murdered because they're Hutu, even though they weren't part of the militia, and they flee the country. The problem is the Hutu militia flees within the civilian population. So there's no way to really separate who the innocent civilian population is and who are former members of these Hutu militias. And that's really what we're going to talk about when we talk about the destabilization of the region. I also want to just introduce you to the term IDP. An IDP is a refugee who doesn't leave their country. So the word refugee means civilian populations that flee a country. Well, what happens if you flee your part of a country or your region of a country, your village, but you don't actually leave the borders of your country? That's called an IDP, an internally displaced person. And you can see the blue tents. These are blue tents provided by the UN. So the UN does come in with humanitarian assistance after the genocide. And because of the events in Bosnia and in Rwanda in 1993, 1994, and so forth, there is this real push in the international community to do something different, to do something better. And they do set up the ICTY and the ICTR. They create this International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where they look for and interview victims, and they look for the perpetrators and they criminally indict them. And so this court was established. The court met in Tanzania, and they put out arrest warrants across the world for these Hutus. Here's an indictment wanted poster that was put out by the ICTR. The ICTR was relatively successful. I think it was actually probably, in my opinion, more successful than the ICTY in Bosnia. And the other thing that I think is interesting about the Rwandan reconciliation process, they went back to their indigenous roots. And while there's the International Criminal Court for the big name perpetrators of the genocide, they do this thing called the Gaka Court, which is an indigenous tribal court system where it's community justice. And it's not retribution. It is, if you own what you did, we can reconcile and maybe move on. It's called justice among the grass, out in the bush. And people will come forward and say, you murdered my parents. You raped me. I saw you beat that person. And then that person who's being accused stands up, and they might admit that they do it. Maybe they deny they did it. Maybe they didn't do it. But there's a community conversation. At best, it's a really grassroots, no pun intended, form of reconciliation. There are always fears that it can turn into victor's justice, though. Here is all of the evidence that's been collected, these witness testimonies by these Gagaka courts. And then we have Bill Clinton's apology, and it's very problematic. Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992. He took the oath of office in 1993. In those first 2 years of his presidency, we have the genocides in Bosnia and the genocides in Rwanda. And as much as France is very culpable for instigating or supporting the genocide, in my opinion, the United States could have done more. And I find his apology to be problematic. He said, we were not fully aware and we didn't appreciate the depth and speed of what was happening. You're the president of the United States. Why don't you know? You get intel briefings from every country in the world every morning. How come you don't know? And in a taped interview, he says, we didn't know. And again, that really irks me. We did know. When Bush was elected president, he received updates on the reconciliation process in Rwanda. President Bush visited Rwanda himself, just like Bill Clinton did a couple of years earlier. And President Bush said, there is an evil in the world and that evil must be confronted. And he condemned the Rwandan genocide. And interestingly, in one of the reports he got on the Rwandan genocide, this got leaked to the press and it's very well known now. He wrote in a cursive in the margins of the report, not on my watch. So he's denouncing the Rwandan genocide and implicitly criticizing Bill Clinton, right? It didn't happen on my watch. And yet, let's talk about President Bush, who was president when the Darfur genocide was happening in the Sudan, and he did nothing. So he's criticizing Bill Clinton for doing nothing on a genocide that occurred when Bill Clinton was president, but then he turned around and didn't do anything when a genocide occurred in his presidency, and so forth. And remember Armenia and the Armenian genocide, how people, including Governor Bush, ran for president saying that they would recognize the Armenian genocide and then swiftly became president of the United States and then kept their mouth shut for 8 years. So there is this interesting delusion, denial, stage 10, regarding all genocide, but in particular, President Clinton and President Bush, in my opinion. The image in the center is an image from the Kigali Genocide Memorial. Kigali is the capital of Rwanda. And this is my friend Antoine. And he is, as I said, the director of the Kigali Memorial. He is also a survivor of the genocide. And he's an incredible man. The Kigali Memorial over here. So this is the capital. Maybe we can get a street view here. And here we are. And this is the Genocide Memorial in Kigali, Rwanda. The Kigali Memorial itself has the remains of 250,000 people, 250,000 of the Tutsis that were murdered in only 90 or 100 days. There are 6 official genocide memorials within Rwanda today, and several of them are located within Catholic churches that were massacre sites, and that would be this memorial. And you can see the skulls of those who died. So here we are in Rwanda at one of the genocide memorials. Here's the courtyard of the memorial. And here we have a more abstract memorial. So I find it interesting how genocides are memorialized, sometimes using authentic space like those Catholic churches and the exposed human remains, and sometimes artistic abstract installations. In this one, we're back to authentic space. President Paul Kagame said, "We cannot turn the clock back. We can't undo the harm caused. We have the power to determine the future and ensure that it never happens again." Never again, that chant from the Holocaust. And yet it keeps happening. When will we finally say, never again?